think the most significant developments in property law. The other states will just follow along with what Texas and California do. That's just usually how it works. Okay. In the state, the marital unit, the couple, is viewed as a partner. Both the husband and the unit for their mutual benefit. Whatever one earns is deemed owned by both. Any salary that comes in is presumptively shared. Even if the couple puts it in separate bank accounts, right? In New York, at least, if you put your money in separate bank accounts to keep everything kind of segregated, the presumption is it's separate. Not so in Texas, right? Whatever money comes in is presumptively community property. Any land you purchase, any car you buy, anything you purchase, anything you earn is presumptively community property. Inheritances and gifts are considered separate. Those are always sort of a separate category historically. So if a wife, long lost uncle, not marital property. But just about everything else is, right? Almost everything else is considered joint. If you acquired it before the marriage, separate. If it's a gift or inheritance, separate. Almost everything else is considered community property. Okay. Couples in community property states are allowed to sign prenuptial agreements, which some of you may do one day, which is wonderful. You say, oh, we keep everything separate. But then if you start deviating from your agreement and you start keeping stuff together and you start commingling money, guess what? Your funds are now community property. So even though it's possible in theory to have a prenuptial agreement, prenuptial, nuptials like your wedding vows, pre means before, so you have an agreement before your wedding vows. Post-nuptial, you may not be so diligent. And often these agreements are simply just unenforceable, which often happens. Here, fractions matter. Everything down the middle, 50-50. Right? Whatever earnings, for every dollar one spouse earns, 50 cents for spouse A and 50 cents for spouse B. Why distribute the success of the marriage? Right? The husband and the wife contribute equally of the marriage. Therefore, each should have an equal share of the proceeds from their joint efforts. Right? This is the idea that if the one spouse chooses to work and the other spouse chooses to stay at home and support the kids, they're both contributing to the success of the family, and they both are entitled to half of the proceeds. Right? Look at question number 2. It says husband and wife are married in Texas. Husband owns a salary of about $1,000, which he deposits in his personal bank account. Then the husband buys 10 shares of stock with that money. And the shares are titled in husband's name only. The husband and wife get divorced. What will the wife receive through equitable division? 0 shares, 5 shares, $0, 500. Before Christina in a few seconds. All right. Yeah. What is your answer, my friend? Why do you say B? Does it matter that the money was in his personal account? Makes no difference. Does it matter that the shares were titled for his name? No. Okay, that's right. The answer 5 shares. That's correct. Not here. Okay, that's pretty good. Some of you put $500, which is not unreasonable. Let me explain why I think it's not the best answer. Once you have the shares of the stock, the cash property, presumptively, when the husband spent that $1,000 on it as a unit with his wife, so effectively the wife, in theory at least, consented to the sale. You're not forced to sell the shares of the stock, right? What is community property now? It's not the money anymore. What is community property is the stock themselves. Often this is a point you may not realize. Selling stock, you can take a hit right if the value goes up, goes down. So there's no repo. I think here the right answer is 5 shares. That's good, 90%. Right? What to get at here is that when you're in a community property, everything's down the middle. Even if you try to keep stuff bank account with shares of stock, that's nice. Your wife has full access to it, right? You got a life insurance policy. Guess what? If you're married, you're gonna make sure your wife is a beneficiary. Don't even write it to you otherwise, because it's not gonna be enforceable because the wife can take her cut anyway. Understood so far? Makes sense? Oh yes, Jaime.
I'm just a little bit just to clarify. If you were to buy 10 credit cards, the wife could choose to buy to sell it.
She can do whatever she wants after the divorce. But she's not to keep. Well, in this question, right, they get divorced, and the court has to engage in the equitable distribution of the assets. So what the court will say is 5 shares go to the wife, 5 shares go to the husband, and the wife can then. Well, before the divorce, it's up to the husband and wife. If it, I mean, I think I see what you're getting at, right? If during the marriage the husband wants to sell, the wife doesn't, that's a marital dispute. They can't go to court over that, right? I mean, generally think couples can work things out on their own. Absent allegations of abuse, the courts will not get involved, right? I mean, this may be a surprise to you, but husbands and wife don't always agree on things, and spouses often don't, right? I'm sure your parents or they work stuff out on their own, or they don't, and then in which case it's a problem. But that maybe is why they get divorced. They can't figure out the finances together. All right. Everyone with me? All right. So generally, almost all money in the marriage is going to be community property. In Texas, even, let's say you have a separate property, right? Let's say you own a property from before the marriage, and that property generates rent. Guess what? The rent from the separate property is community income. The rent generated from the separate property is community income. So in Texas, even if you have a separate property that's generate rental income, the money from that property is now community, and it's split in half. So I'm trying to tell you, it's very hard to keep anything separate if you're married in Texas. It's very hard. In other states, I think California, the rent is considered separate. It's not community property, but in Texas, there is. Rental income is community property. Everyone with me so far? Yes, Jackie. The presumption is it should be. If you're a husband and wife together and you're jointly deciding to rent the property, then that was your joint decision. You should be able to share the proceeds. The presumption is everything is right. It's actually the opposite we think, right? In most states, you have to show there was some sort of intent to sort of commingle. Here, it's the opposite, right? In Texas, any property acquired during the marriage is presumptively community property. And to overcome that presumption, you need a preponderance of the evidence, right? As you think of like more than 50%, like 51%, you need to show it's more likely that both the couples, both husband and wife, intended to keep their property separate, right? If one spouse says, no, that was not my intent, you're not going to win. And that's usually what happens. One spouse says, no, that's community. The other spouse says, oh, it's separate. And there's always this he said, she said, which is hard to win under preponderance standard. Commingling. I used this phrase before. if for whatever reason money kind of swishes back and forth between accounts, right, and one spouse has access to the other spouse and sort of deposit and withdraw, and the money sort of moves around, the account becomes tainted, so to speak. It is now going to be all community property. Really, the only way to avoid this is to have a written agreement. The husband and wife sign a written agreement stating that we intend for X to be separate property, whatever X is. If it's an account, a brokerage account, a piece of land, Blackacre, whatever, right? They must have in writing. Some states oral, but you should really have this in writing. And there's a word I'll type on the board. Transmute. Transmute is when you say, we are converting this piece of community property to separate. Or the other way around, we are converting separate property to community. You can do either way. But to transmute something, it must be an agreement between the spouses. And it really should be in writing. I would not recommend doing this orally because it's too risky. Remember, from contracts, an oral contract is very hard to enforce in general. Same here. And even if you keep things separate, let's say that, let's say you have Blackacre and you agree to keep it separate, but then you use community property to sort of improve upon it, make renovations, etc. That might be representing commingling. And the court could say, well, by putting joint money into this property, you made it community property. It's all risk, right? You don't know what a court will do in several years looking at the situation, and they may decide, sorry, it's 50-50. Questions? Oh, yes, Alex. Someone asked me this last class. I don't remember how many days you can get annulment. Someone could probably Google that. It's not very much. And I suppose if you get enough, if you got married, there wasn't much community property that was acquired. Although there's that one case reference in the book where the guy dies on the altar, right? I think that was in your reading, right? Where he said, I do, and he dropped dead. And so in theory, at that point, whatever they had together would have been community property. And so, but I think annulments are fairly rare. I wouldn't worry about those. Actually, I don't know. Someone looked it up. How many days can you get an annulment in Texas? How many? Is that right? 72 hours? I mean, so we're talking about 3 days. I don't think you can acquire much marital property in 3 days. And maybe you can. I don't know. Yeah? Well, I'm sorry, you guys, one at a time. Okay, so you have a month. Okay. So again, I don't know how much property you can acquire in a month, but you say, honey, everything's yours, and then she's like, okay, adios, right? So I don't know if there's actually an equitable distribution after annulment. I have no idea. I think it's such a short period, but I'm not sure. I've seen it, but maybe it happens. Or let me say it differently. Generally, the people who get annulled marriages aren't always most savvy, right? Because they probably shouldn't have gotten that marriage in the first place. But I don't know. What do I know? It happens. Didn't Britney Spears have an annulled marriage when she married this guy's name was Jason Alexander? It wasn't George Costanza. It was a guy named Jason Alexander back in 2000 or so. Am I right on that one? Yeah. And I think no, the Kardashian did an annulment, but she just got divorced very quickly against her first husband. All right, enough. Let's move on. Property state reach community property. The creditor can reach also separate property, right? But generally, if one spouse has a debt, right, if only you can't go after the community property, right? If there's only one spouse as a debtor, you can't go after the community property. This is sort of like the rule in Sawada versus Endo, right? Where you have these various regimes, right? These different categories. And in one of the categories, I think it was 3. I get the number wrong. I'm sorry. I think it was there's a separate, and that's the rule here. which is why you don't really need the tenancy by the entirety. Right? The entirety exists to shield couples from credit. Really no need in Texas to have a tenancy by the entirety. It doesn't really add anything. It kind of technically exists, but it doesn't really, and it's not important to know why. Okay? You want to get that part on the creditors, right? If you're a bank and husband has a debt, you can't go to the community properties to satisfy it. Okay. All right. So I keep saying, everything's 50-50, everything's 50-50. It's not exactly 50-50, right? On divorce. Most have what's called equitable distribution. Equitable distribution does not mean equal distribution. Right? Equitable distribution does not mean equal distribution. It might be 50. Who was at fault in the breakup of the marriage? Adultery doesn't matter. Is there different earning potential? Does one spouse have more earning potential than the other? What about health? Maybe, think of Albert Pujols, right? Maybe one of the spouses is very sick. So this Albert Pujols was a famous baseball player. He just divorced his wife the day after she had brain surgery. Yeah, MVP right there. Which spouse has custody? Sorry, does that mean? Okay. Which spouse has custody of children, education, employability, etc. So again, I said here 5 shares, and that's probably the easiest way of doing it. But you can imagine a situation where equity might compel a different result. But in theory, at least, it's 50-50. Okay. All right. Yes, Amar.
Are some of those more important than others?
Wow, I can't give you a good answer because it's such discretionary, right? When we're talking about equitable factors, unless the court abuses its discretion, the higher court will not reverse. So there's not any sort of fixed balancing. All right, any questions so far? Okay, there it goes. Property states there's no dour or courtesy. I don't really care about that, but it doesn't exist in Texas, so don't worry about it. Okay. All right. The hardest part of today's class, this is the hardest part, concerns the joint tenancy. Okay. Brianne, just refresh your memory. What is a joint tenancy that we've studied so far?
A joint tenancy is where two tenants basically share the 4 interests
Right.
at the same time, and they right of survivorship.
Correct.
So whenever one dies, and the other gets to be possessed.
So you say they have separate but undivided interests, right? They have separate interests. Can a married couple in Texas have separate interests?
No.
No, they can't. So can they have a joint tenancy? No. You're right. So far, we've been talking about joint tenancies. I didn't make this point, but I want to make this point very clear now. Everything we've done about joint tenancy so far has been in a common law state, right? Every question I've asked you about a joint tenancy or by the entirety has been in a common law state. Why? The rules for joint tenancy in Texas are different. A joint tenancy in Texas is very different than a joint tenancy in New York, right? Why? For the reason Brianne told us a moment ago. A husband and wife cannot have separate interests. A husband and wife have separate interests. Everything must be community shared interests, but they're the same. So I use, you won't see it elsewhere, but it helps me make sense. What I call a quasi-joint tenancy. When you have a joint tenancy I call it a quasi-joint tenancy, and it's a name that I made up. You won't see it, but it will avoid confusion. That way in Texas. So just for the sake of my and maybe for your other, just use this label. Okay. The reason why the joint tenancy in Texas resembles a joint tenancy in New York, but it's a little bit different, right? The biggest difference between New York and Texas is that in Texas, there are not separate shares, right? Husband and wife cannot have separate shares. Okay? There are not separate shares. They own the property together. Okay? There is no right of survivorship. This is very important. The entire idea of a right of survivorship is that one spouse gets the other spouse's share, right? But there are no separate. Therefore, there is no right of survivorship. If one joint tenant wants to sell his interest, he can do that. Texas, there are no separate interests. So spouse cannot sell his separate interests. He cannot break the unities. Right? Both have to consent to because they're a community together. In that regard, the quasi-joint tenancy resembles a tenancy by the entirety, where one spouse cannot sell his interest. Again, so a couple differences, right? There are not separate shares. There is no right of survivorship. One spouse cannot break. All right. So now you see why he's quasi-joint tenancy. The exam and whatever else questions you have, pay very close attention to what state. Very different. If I just say, Blackacre to husband and wife as joint tenants, you better know what state you're in because the rules are completely different over how it breaks down upon death and divorce. Everyone with me so far? All right. So if there's no right of survivorship, what happens upon the death of the spouse? All right. Let's walk through this. All right. I'll give you an example. Okay. Let's say the husband and wife own Blackacre as joint tenants in Texas. Right? The husband and wife own Blackacre as joint tenants in Texas. Okay. What this means here has 50% share in Blackacre, and the wife has a 50% share in Blackacre. Okay. They're not shares. They own 50% of the same interest. See, there's a difference, right? It's not husband has this share and the wife has that share. It's they own 50% of the same interest, right? They own it together. When the husband dies, he can direct up to 50% of his interest. What? The wife guaranteed half the husband's property, right? The wife is guaranteed half of the husband's property. So maybe the husband says, I give all my share to the wife. The husband's 50%, which is 100%. But the husband might say, I want to give half of my property to a son. Lose you. We'll try it again. Okay. When the husband dies, the wife keeps her 50%. The husband can dispose of half of his half. He can give up to 25% by his will. One more time. They have a 50-50 split in this joint tenancy. Under the rule of community property, the husband can give up to half of the house, but half is reserved for the wife. Roll with me. If he gives, let's say, 25% of his will to his son, then the wife gets the remaining 25%. This is the hardest part of this class. The husband can dispose of half of his interest. All right? Half of his interest. But his interest is 50%, meaning the husband can give 25% to his will, but the wife takes 25%. Everybody with me? I don't believe you, but it's okay. Let's do a question number 3 that I think will help bring this to focus a little bit, I hope, at least. All right, this will be for Rodney in a minute or so. Husband and wife are married in Texas. Husband saves $5,000 from his own earnings, which he deposits in savings account in his own name. Husband withdraws $5,000 and buys Blackacre, and they take title as joint tenants. The husband dies. His will leaves all the separate and community property to S, his son, for another marriage. Which of the following statements are true? The wife owns 0% of Blackacre, and S owns 100%. Wife owns 50. Son owns 50. Wife owns 75. Son owns 25. Wife owns 100. Son owns 0. All right, take your time on this one. Okay. Rodney, what is your answer here, my friend?
Said C.
Okay, why do you say C?
Well, so while they're both still alive, we're at 50-50.
Okay.
As soon as husband dies, 25% of his share, half of his share, automatically goes to the rest of that 25%. You do it whatever you want, and you get the S. So that's why S is 25.
Okay, you're correct. Okay. Whew, right? Yeah. That's what we got, the results. Okay. Wow. That's overwhelming. That's for all cheating. That's really good. No. Usually it's never that high. I've when it's that good, it's like when there's an election, like 110% vote for a candidate. Wow, that's really high. Like a Russian election. Wow, you got Putin 110% of votes. Wow, it's impressive. Anyway, yeah, Rodney, you're correct. Good job. Let's walk through this question one step at a time. The fact that the $5,000 were put in a savings account in his own name doesn't matter, right? He bought Blackacre and agreed to titles of joint tenancy. That was their choice, right? If you were in New York and the husband died, Rodney, what would the wife get here? If this was, say, in New York, how much? No. If Blackacre was in New York, what would the wife have gotten upon death? What are the rules for tenancies in New York? There we go. You see how that's important, right? If this was in New York and they were a married couple in New York, survivorship kicks in, the wife gets 100%. But because it's in Texas, she only gets 75%. So in this regard, a married couple, surviving spouse is slightly worse off than she would be in New York. With our survivorship, she gets everything. But with the Texas regime, she might only get 75%. The husband can give her everything, right? The husband can leave her the entire share. Then she'd have 50 plus 50 is 100. But because the husband has a chance of writing out the wife out of the will, she gets half of his half, which is 25%. She keeps her own 50%, adds the husband's 25%, gets 75%. Yes, so Brianna.
more advantageous to have it as joint tenants than keeping it community property, right? Because the wife would get more share.
Well, hold on, but the joint tenancy is community property.
Okay. But like
Quasi, the word I use is the quasi joint tenancy. That is community property. There's nothing special. Look, there's nothing special about a joint tenancy, right? Even it doesn't really matter what you call it. It's community property. That's why the label is less important. The husband and wife own Black Acres community property. Therefore, upon death, there's no survivorship rights. The husband can dispose of half of his assets and the other half goes to his wife. Make sense?
I'm still a little. So what if they decided not to make it into joint tenancy?
It wouldn't matter.
It would still be 75%.
I don't care what you call it. You can call it a tenancy in common. You can call it whatever. You can call it Shirley, right? It doesn't matter what you call it. You seen Airplane? There's a line in the movie that says, "And don't call me Shirley," right? Anyway, so this is perhaps dating myself. It's a good movie. But Brianna, I do want to answer your question carefully, without joking. It doesn't matter what you call it in Texas. I call it a quasi joint tenancy. It really doesn't matter. It's community property. So it's not, is it a joint tenancy or is it community property? It is community property. Any asset a married couple has in Texas must be community property unless they sort of have an agreement contrary, something in writing. And with any community property asset, whether it's shares of stock or Black Acre, whatever you have, the husband can only dispose of half of his share, and the wife gets the other half. Now, the husband might be a good person and say, "Honey, I leave you my entire share." Then she'll have her 50 plus his 50, and that gets to 100. Zach?
Is there a possibility of like for S want to see partition because like he has 25% interest in Black Acre?
After the father's death, he could, yeah. And he could ask the court to partition it. He could. Right, which is another reason why survivorship is important. You get 100%. There's no one else to partition with. All right. All right. Everyone with me so far? Oh, yes, Lillian, please. Well, in New York, the wife would get survivorship. It never goes to probate. Right? The idea of the survivorship right is it kicks in automatically. There's never a probate process. The courts never can divide it up. It goes to the wife immediately upon his death. That makes sense? Okay. All right. One concept I just want to sort of highlight is this concept of the manager. The manager. It's sort of a weird idea, but historically in a community property state, one spouse was deemed to be the manager. And that spouse could sort of make decisions by himself, right? Of how and it was always him, right? It's always the guy, but he can make decisions how the rule anymore, right? Now, presumptively, any transaction that one spouse makes, the other spouse, in theory, at least, has to sign off on. And what happens if one spouse makes a transaction the other spouse does not agree with? Spouse number two can go to court and seek a return of that payment. Where does this arise? Usually when one spouse is having, let's just say, lady friends, and is buying valuables for his girlfriend. And presumptively, the wife did not consent to those gifts. So this is the crazy part. The wife can actually go to court and ask the girlfriend to return the gifts and to set aside gifts. Yeah, I think that's a conversation. It happens. It happens in California actually quite a bit. The book has the story of W.C. Fields, who was a famous movie star. He had married a woman named Harriet, earned a lot of money. They separated, but they were never legally divorced. Right? And even though they were separated, their earnings were still considered community property at the time. he basically left his wife next to nothing in his will. But he'd given all this money to gifts to lady friends, as they call them in the book. Should be returned to the wife, right? The husband can give his share of the money, but he could avoid the wife's share. So actually, the court ordered the return. A more recent example, the owner of the Los Angeles Clippers, remember Donald Sterling? This ring a bell? Vistaviano. Now it's 10 years old, this story. Anyway, so he's the owner of the LA Clippers, very wealthy guy who had a girlfriend, and his wife basically demanded the girlfriend return all the cars and the jewelry, etc. And she won. She prevailed. So if you're in a community property state like Texas and you're having an affair and your spouse finds out, whatever money you gave to the girlfriend, they can claw back. The things you learn in class, right? It's there. All right, everyone with me? All right, so we've talked about the joint tenancy. We've talked about the gifts to the let's talk about mixing community property with separate property. Let's say that a wife purchased a house on an installment contract where she agrees to make 100 payments, one a month for however many months it is to buy off the house. And some of the payments are made before the marriage, and the rest of the payments are made after the marriage. In other words, part of the purchase price is paid before the marriage, separate funds, and part of the purchase price is made after the marriage from community funds. Is the house then a community asset? Is the house a separate asset? Okay. There are different rules in different states. Texas follows what's called the inception of right rule. In Texas, whatever the property is when the contract begins, it stays that way. So if the contract was formed before the marriage, it stays a separate property, right? Blackberry does not become a marital property because community funds were paid to cover it. Again, the house is separate property. With me? Other states have what's called time vesting rule. Instead of looking when the contract was formed, you look when the contract was finalized. That's when the last payment was made. And because the last payments were made, they were together, they were married, it becomes marital property. So in this case, the house Blackwick would become marital property. Everybody with me? The most complicated one, of course, is California. It always is, which is called the pro rata apportion. I always spelled this wrong. Apportionment case. So if the value of the house is $100,000, and let's say half of it was paid through separate funds and half was paid through community funds, then basically half the property would be separate and half would be community, which makes things really complicated, right? You determine based on how much money was used to pay off the debt, which was community property, community funds, which was separate funds. It's a very complicated one. I'm not going to ask you to do this one because it's messy. I will ask the Texas one and the time investing one, but the California one is just very, very, very complex. I've tried doing it in the past, and the students just vanish, so I stopped asking it. You're welcome. Everyone with me? All right. All right. Let's do some questions. All right. Let's do question 4A. 4A. Let's wait for Ben in a few moments. All right. Let me read it. Husband and wife are married in Texas. Husband purchases a $100,000 life insurance policy with his salary. The beneficiary of the policy is the son. That is, the wife is not a beneficiary. The husband dies. Which of the following statements are true? Wife receives 0 and son receives $100,000. Wife receives $25,000 and the son receives $75,000. Wife receives 50, son receives 50. Wife receives 100 and son receives 50. Who gets the which of the following statements are true? Take your time with this one. All right, another 10 seconds. All right, Ben, let's walk through this, right? Okay, so you have a husband, wife, they're married. Okay. Was this insurance policy purchased before or after they got married?
I mean, from the way I read it,
Okay, that's right. You're right. Okay. Was it purchased with his separate funds or with his spend? Yeah, good. You avoid the trick question. Good. Right. Unless I give you facts otherwise, you presume that any money spent is a community fund. And then we find that then he makes his son his sole beneficiary. He gives his wife nothing as well. I'm sorry, his life insurance policy. Why can't he do that? What is the husband allowed to convey? What percentage of his interest can he convey? Well, no, it's not. Well, it's not 25%. What is he allowed to convey? Half of his no. See, this is where people get tripped up. He can convey half of his interest, right? With a joint tenancy, what is his interest? Half of what? Of the joint okay. Okay, let's see this clear, okay? This point always trip people up. With a joint, it's 50-50, right? He can convey half of his 50% interest, which is 25%, right? He can convey as well half of his 50% interest, which is 25%. Ben, in this case, when you have a $100,000 life insurance policy, is there any present interest in that money? Is there any present interest in the $100,000 life insurance policy? Can you go to the bank and take out your life insurance policy today? Yeah. Is there anything? Oh, hello, Lisa. Sorry. Is there any actual present interest in life insurance policy? Is the $100,000 marital property? Does it exist in the marriage?
The policy would exist.
Does the money exist while the couple's still married? No. Can the money exist at any point while husband's still alive? When does that money come into existence? At his death. So let me ask the question again, Ben. Is the $100,000 marital property? No. This is an important point. A life insurance payout, right? The payout from the life insurance policy cannot be marital property because it does come paid. It doesn't get paid. There's no present interest in the life insurance money. It does not get paid out until the death of the husband. All right, Miranda, let me ask you the next question, please. What percentage of this $100,000 can the husband give to his heir, give to his son? 50%. Can he give all of it to his son? I mean, and if you read the question, he gave everything to his son, the sole beneficiary. Can the husband do that? No. Why not?
Because it was marital property,
Right. So what's the most he can give to his son?
50,000.
And what does the wife get? Does it matter what he wrote in his will? In the insurance policy? So what's your answer here? The answer is C. So we got. Ooh. So most of you put either C, and about a third of you put D. Right? See, I was expecting someone to put B, which only a handful of you put. All right? The answer here is C. Let me explain why. The husband can only dispose of 50% of it that he has, right? This life insurance policy is considered an asset he has, paid for with community funds. Because it was paid for, dispose of half of it. Even though he wrote everything, it's ineffective, right? It's as if he didn't write it. The wife first, and it's give me my share, give me my half. This is not an elective share, and make that very, very clear in your notes. In Texas, in a community property state, there's no elective share, right? There's nothing to elect. Someone asked this question last week. There's nothing to elect. This is how it goes. The insurance company will know the husband's married, and they'll just be like, that's nice, you wrote that, where's your wife? We'll give her half. They won't even give the son the full amount at the outset because they know it doesn't belong to him. Because it was paid for with community funds, the wife gets her cut. So I'm pretty sure in Texas, if you actually try to buy a life insurance policy and you're married, and you don't include your wife as the beneficiary, at least for half, they'll probably reject the policy. They won't even sell it because like you're just going to waste our time. We're going to have to deal with all these, all who the spouses, who the sons, etc. So the wife will get half of whatever the marital property assets are, and once that's paid out, the wife gets her cut. Yes, Christina.
So since the policy was bought with community funds, wouldn't she already have like a 50% that's similar to property?
Yes, she has that. Right, she has that interest. Well, I want to answer your question very carefully. A life insurance policy is unique in that it doesn't pay out till the person dies. So let's say the wife dies first. The wife is not going to get that payout. Right? If the wife dies first, the wife's estate's not going to get the payout. This only works if the husband dies first and the wife gets it by virtue of her marital property. Does that make sense? No. Try it again.
I guess I'm not understanding for this policy. You bought it with their money. I
Correct.
think that she would have 50% interest, so it would end up the same 75.5.
No, okay, so there's two different elements. Maybe this might make more sense, right? You have a life insurance policy, right? That's this agreement between the husband and the insurance company, right? $400,000, right? Okay, let me explain this, right? Life insurance is basically gambling, right? The insurance company is hoping you die old, and your words, you might die young, right? You're all young and healthy, right? Or you're all young. If you want to buy an insurance policy, they'll be like, "Oh my God, yeah, let me sell it to you because actuarially, young people tend not to die," right? I know that sounds awful, but it's true, right? So you might get $1 million policy and pay, $100 a month, right? You might pay a very small amount of money to actually get this policy because the insurance company is saying you're not going to die because you're all young and healthy, right? If you're older, if you're in your 80s and you want to buy a life insurance policy, good luck. They're going to make you pay a lot of money to get very little in return. So let's say this question is a $100,000 life insurance policy. Maybe they only pay a few $1,000s in premiums, right? You pay maybe a few $1,000s over the course of a few years, and the husband dies suddenly. At that point, the money being paid out is not itself unique because the husband's dead to the wife. But because the policy was paid for with marital funds, the wife basically says, I have a 50% claim, whatever is paid out. Right? Whatever eventually is paid out, I can get half of it because it was paid for, right? The contract itself becomes a marital contract, and the wife can get the cut of it. Does that help at all? No, that's fair. That's fair. I mean, no, maybe it's unfair because you haven't really dealt with life insurance, right? It's just not something most law students have dealt with. Alex?
It's not marital.
So be careful. The policy itself, right? The agreement with the insurance company is going to be a marital asset. The payout, the actual which is over. So there's different elements there. Yeah. Yeah, if there's no wife, then there's no one to take their cut. I think we'll ask the question in a few minutes. Right, I'll give you a preview now, right? What would happen, though, if the husband purchased the policy before marriage, but continue making premium payments each month after marriage, right? In other words, for an insurance policy to be effective, you have to keep making monthly payments. If you stop payments, they cancel the policy. So even if you pay out the policy before marriage, there might be need after you get married. I think that's actually my next question. Or maybe a question later in class. I think it's which one? Which one is it? Okay, all right. I'll get there later. All right. Question on 4A. Yeah, that's 4B. It's very nice. You were scheduled. I was going to the next minute. All right. Any questions on 4A? But I think a lot of you put that the wife gets all of it, and that can't be right, right? The husband can still give away half of his assets in his will, and he gave half of it to his son.
Why half of his assets are not 50%
I know. With the prior question, this question always throws people off every year. It's a hard concept. Insurance policy, there is no present interest. No 50% share in the money now. He will never have a share, right? This is something in a life insurance policy. You can never have a share in your own life insurance policy because you're dead, right? You can't anything. But it's not 50% of a 50% share. It's going to be after it pays out, half to be disposed of, and that goes to someone else, right? You can't have an interest in your life insurance policy. It's impossible. Does that help a little bit?
He has no interest.
Right, because he's dead. Right, you cannot. A person cannot have an interest in his own life insurance policy. It's impossible. There's gonna be 100% payout, half of which the husband controls, and the other half goes to the wife. But if they get divorced, here, the wife gets some. Okay, and let me read it for you, and then take some time to think about it. Purchasing. I'm sorry, H, not husband. This actually matters here. H purchases and premiums. The sole beneficiary of the policy is S, the son. Then H and W get married. Ooh. And then H pays $50,000 more in premiums. So to your question, Christine, in this one, he paid $60,000 and he got a $100,000 payout. With the insurance company, they make a bad bet, right? They took in $60,000 in cash, but paid it $100,000, right? He died early, apparently. They want you to. The insurance company wants you to pay out of the life of the insurance policy more than they're going to give you, right? They don't want to give you anything, and they're hoping that maybe you miss a payment and you get sick, and and a lot of life insurance policies are term limited. They're only good for say 10 years just to get a new rate. Okay, things you learn. Not now. Okay. All right. Again, when the husband,
It was separate property.
yeah, he wasn't married yet. You can do that, right? And then he paid those $10,000 in premiums. Was that 10
Thousand premium, whenever he first signed it, it was,
payments with the
that's marital.
Okay. Husband dies. The only beneficiary is the son. What does the wife get here?
Are we in Texas?
Doesn't actually matter. I know why you're asking that question. Actually, doesn't matter.
Say that a son received a full policy.
Wife gets nothing. How do you account, Red, for the fact they paid $50,000 in federal assets into this? The wife get nothing for that?
The exception of right rule, I think.
That I told you that
It's just separate property because he signed the contract before he was.
wife putting 50 grand in their community property. Does she get nothing to show for that?
I believe so.
All right, Tiffany, what do you think?
Even though she put in 50,000.
So you agree with Red?
Yeah.
All right, that's what we got here. Oh, people are fluctuating. Oh, I forgot to turn it off. Oh, okay, fine. You're revising your answer. Okay. So 40% of you put B, 25% you put A, another third put C. A community state to keep in mind is the wife will never get nothing. Almost never. She always gets something. The trick is so the was asking what jurisdiction you're in. I know exactly why he was asking it. He was thinking of the inception rule. That applies for installment contracts. That does not apply for a insurance policy. So really, it doesn't matter what state. The policy itself remains a separate asset, right? The policy itself is not marital. But the wife can say, hey, wait a minute. You paid for this thing with marital property. You paid $50,000 of these proceeds for marital property. Guess what? I can seek half of those $50,000 in proceeds. The wife can say to the insurance company, I know I'm not a beneficiary, but I want my half back, which means the wife gets 25. And because 25, the son gets whatever's left over from the policy. He gets 75. The rule is going to be, my friend, the surviving spouse will almost never get nothing. Surviving get something to cover the premiums, the monthly premiums you pay. She can recover half of those premiums. The wife gets 25, and the son gets 75 here. That's the answer. Well, was your question about? I know. It's okay. You guys are all thinking on the right track. I wonder why that's the case. So when you're looking at these questions, you have to think not only what is the policy paying out, but what was being paid in, and the premiums the wife gets back. Right? I wouldn't give you that information unless it was useful. So if I give you a question by saying they paid X dollars a month, you should probably be thinking, okay, that means that they're probably going to be giving back a percentage of the premiums they pay each month. Questions? Yes, Ryder?
So in the event, let's say he put $10,000 in premiums and then the community property that paid into the premium was $60,000. Does she get $30,000?
She gets half whatever community property was put into it. Now, it can get even weirder, right? I mean, this does happen. Let's say they paid $110,000 in premiums and the policy only paid out $100,000. Right? I mean, this happens. The insurance policy can't take money out of thin air basically give all of it to the wife, or they'd have no. The example of, let's say they pay $200,000 of premiums, right, into a $100,000 policy, it would basically have to give everything to the wife. Some will get nothing. It happens.
So this would be different than commingling. You said that life insurance will remain separate property.
Well, it's not that life insurance remains separate. There's no payout to the husband's dead. And when the husband's dead, there's no community left. There's no couple, right? The husband's dead. So again, you're not seeking any sort of present money. You're simply seeking half whatever you paid to come back to. The husband could have just left the wife half in his will, or made the wife a partial beneficiary, which case she's gotten 50, but he's stuck with 25. So what I'm trying to tell you is the surviving spouse will always get something, right? No matter how you slice it, they're going to find a way to get something. It's very rare they'll get zero. All right. Everyone get this question. Couples. Yeah, it sounds like couples who move states. A couple gets married in New York, acquires some property there, then they retire in Austin. Or a couple, let's say, is married in California, retired in Florida. All right. And we think about two concepts, right? Where marriages and where do they die, right? New York is common law, and then they die in Texas, which is community, or it could be the other way around. Okay. If any of you ever in practice and found your couple and someone's going through a divorce, say, "Oh, you were married in New York." That creates a lot of complexities. It does, because people don't realize. All right, so a few rules, right? Generally, when property is acquired, it's characterized as either a community or separate. I'm sorry, community or common law, right? It doesn't change, right? However, property is at the time it's acquired, that's how it remains. Unless you transmute, that's the word I used earlier, right? Transmutation. So if you buy a horse in New York and then you transport that horse to Texas, the horse remains separate property. If you buy a horse in Texas and a horse to New York, the horse remains community property. That matters. Okay. Another rule, something called the law of the situs. Law of the situs classes. With real property, you can't move it, right? Blackacre is going to stay wherever Blackacre is. Right? Blackacre is in New York. You can't move Blackacre to Texas. It doesn't work that way. It stays in New York. It remains common law property. Community in Texas, it stays in Texas. No matter where you live, it remains community property. Okay. Now, another concept to keep in mind, the elective share. We said this class, the elective share only exists in common law states, right? The elective share only. If a married couple dies or husband dies in Texas, for an elective share. Again, if a husband dies in Texas, the wife cannot petition for an elective. The reason why is we presume that the wife has all this property set, and then they move down to Texas, and the husband writes the wife out of the will. She has no community property, and she can't get an elective share. Wife gets nothing. So the rub is, if you want to actually deceive your spouse, retire in Austin, right? If you have all of your property separate, and I have no evidences, but in theory at least, Go the other way though, it actually works the advantage, right? If you have all this community property in Texas, then you retire. As an example, live in Ohio, and the husband a lot of wealth, $500,000, right? Under Ohio law, the husband's wife could take an elective share of half, which would get $250,000. But he moved to Texas, leaves nothing to his wife in the will. The wife lost her elective share, and she can't see half of the separate property. If you have any friends who want to retire in Texas or Louisiana or somewhere else, they should have an agreement. It's mute their common law property to community property. Right? That would be the right thing to do, to transmute their property, saying this is now all community. But there's no obligation to do that, and the spouse may not want to do that. Everyone with me? Everyone with me? Just for Nick. So let me read it. Husband and wife are married in New York. Husband has $100,000 in a separate savings account. And moved all his property to couple at zero property rental in Austin somewhere. Husband does. His only asset was his savings account. The following statement is true. Wife receives 0, son receives dollars. Wife receives 25, son receives 75. Wife receives 50, and the son receives 50. Or the wife receives 100 and the son receives 0. All right, what's your answer here? Okay, it's actually take another 30 seconds for everyone else. And they'll leave for Nick. Oh, this is Nick and Nick, and I realized that. Okay. All right. What's your thinking?
And then you're not carrying the Texas, it still is separate, it doesn't become.
No, she cannot. Look at that, 80%. Oh, people sort of spread out a bit. Yeah. It's bupkis, 0. You know, bupkis, it means 0. She gets nothing. And the reason why is they've acquired no community property. The only asset they have is $100,000 bank account. It's separate property, and she can't take an elective share. Right, so couples moving this way, the spouse assets can get screwed. I wonder if this is like a deliberate thing people do. I have no idea. Maybe if it has a family lawyer, they may hear this actually happening, but it can happen. I suspect it happens unintentionally, right? Not deliberately. But I wonder if people move to a state to keep the wife out of their will. Yeah, writer.
So is the logic behind this like where the will is being executed?
The state where the husband dies, you apply that law state for. And if you go to a Texas, like to seek an elective share, they'll be like, no, you can't do that here. That law doesn't permit it. Go away. All right, we'll get 4A. I'm sorry, 5A. Let's try 5B with the other Nicholas. All right, and this is the other one, right, where we're in Texas. So husband and wife are married in Texas. They purchased Blackacre, which is located in this is joint tenant. After they retire in New York, the next week, husband dies. The husband's will leaves Blackacre to the son. Can the wife exercise her elective share over Blackacre? All right, that's another 10 seconds. I think we got 5 seconds. We'll stop it here. All right, Nicholas. So again, where's Blackacre located? Texas. Is Blackacre common law or community property? Can you exercise an elective share here? Why not? And correct. The answer is no. Let's see. Ooh, that's kind of close. Here's no, and the answer is because of the law of decidus. With real property, that doesn't you apply the law of where it's located. Where it is community property, and the courts will not let you exercise an elective share over community property in Texas. So again, the wife does not get any share, right? There's no what can. Well, what does the wife actually do here? What? Which 75%? Well, isn't this like the question we did earlier? Right? Isn't this like question? Did I screw up the number? Yeah, question 3. Oh no, sorry. There's no right to survivorship, right? But the wife has her half interest, and she can get half of 75. So in some regards, she gets 75% of Blackacre. That would basically be fair. The elective share is 50%, and she gets 75% here. So in some ways, the elective share is worse. It's actually better to get 75%. But in New York, with our survival, even though she can't use the elective share, she doesn't need to, because the husband can only get 75. So in this way, the community property leaves her better off than she would with an elective share, but worse off than if she had right. So there's sort of trade-offs to these different regimes.
I understand why can't you partition?
Sure. I think to be frank, when you ask them partition sale with a husband and wife, they probably wouldn't. You could ask. Yeah.
Are you able to cherry pick with elective share? So like you have common.
Of course, it's something that you can move around. You could. It's just kind of weird though. But I suppose you could. You get the front half, you get the back half. You know, like the Halloween bit. All right. Questions. All right. Let me wrap up a bit. And I realized I forgot to do the exit poll. I haven't done it in weeks. I feel bad about it. So I'll turn it on to. We have to think about that the surviving spouse can only give half. I'm sorry. The dying spouse can give half of his interest, and the other half goes to this. We have the migrating couple issue. We have the installment contract, the law of the inception. We have a lot of things. So if you want to go back and review the 5 problems here after class, I think that'd be a good thing to do, because these are very easy things for me to test on. Very simple to test on, because I can tell you very quickly jurisdiction. Enjoy your weekend. I will see you on Tuesday.